What if everything you thought you knew about Jesus, his appearance, his demeanor, his role in history, was incomplete, or worse, entirely distorted? In a quiet monastery just outside of Rome, where monks have carefully preserved ancient texts for centuries, something extraordinary happened. A brittle, forgotten parchment, tucked away in a dusty chest, was pulled from obscurity, and it might just rewrite the story of Jesus Christ. This document, known as the Letter of Lentulus, claims to be a first-hand description of Jesus from a Roman official stationed in Judea. It paints a picture of Jesus not as the meek, gentle shepherd many of us grew up with, but as a striking, powerful figure, commanding in presence, almost regal in bearing. A man whose physical and personal intensity captivated everyone around him. The implications? Earth-shaking. Historians were floored when carbon dating at Oxford's radiocarbon lab confirmed the document's material dates back to the 1st century CE, the very era when Jesus lived. For decades, this so-called letter had been dismissed by scholars as a medieval invention, a pious hoax, or a theological curiosity. But now science suggests otherwise. And the contents? They go far beyond the sanitized versions found in stained glass windows or children's Bibles. Imagine Joe Rogan, of all people, reacting to the discovery on his podcast, calling it wild and asking why this story isn't bigger. People believe in resurrections, he said. Why not this? Whether you agree with him or not, it's a question many are now daring to ask. What if our view of Jesus has been narrowed, even deliberately reshaped? Let's take a moment to understand the magnitude here. This isn't just another religious relic. This is a Roman perspective on Jesus, one of the few we've ever seen, written with the tone and detail of someone who may have stood in his presence, someone who wasn't trying to convert you, but to inform the Roman Senate of a growing political and spiritual force in Judea. What's most astonishing is the physical description. The letter talks of a man who was tall, unusually tall for his time, with broad shoulders and a striking, almost warrior-like posture. Not the serene figure from Renaissance paintings, but someone you'd expect to see leading a movement, a presence so magnetic it left people in awe, or even fear. But it's not just about height or muscle. Lentulus described Jesus' hair as fair and slightly wavy, his beard short and light-colored, and his eyes, this is the detail that stops readers cold. His eyes were described as a piercing, luminous blue, a gaze so intense it could unsettle even hardened Roman soldiers. Now let's be clear, this image challenges everything the church has promoted for centuries. Gone is the gentle shepherd holding a lamb. This Jesus sounds like a revolutionary, a visionary leader, a man whose physical appearance alone demanded attention. Why does this matter? Because so much of faith, art, culture, even politics has been built around a specific image of Jesus. And that image might not have come from eyewitnesses. It might have come from artists, popes, or emperors with very different agendas. We've seen this before in history. When narratives become politically useful, uncomfortable truths often get edited out. Think of how early Christian writings like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary were declared heretical and hidden for centuries. Could the Lentulus letter have suffered a similar fate? The timing of its discovery couldn't be more ironic, or perhaps providential. At a moment when faith is being re-examined, when traditional institutions are being questioned, this letter invites us to look again. Not just at Jesus, the symbol, but at Jesus, the man. And the question we now face is this: if the letter is authentic and even partially accurate, what do we do with it? That's exactly what we'll explore in the next section, where we dive deeper into who this mysterious Publius Lentulus was, why he might have written this letter, and how his words could alter 2,000 years of belief. To understand why this letter could rewrite history, we need to know the man behind it. Who was Publius Lentulus? And why would a Roman official take the time to write a detailed report about a Jewish preacher on the eastern edge of the empire? Strangely enough, Roman records don't give us much. Publius Lentulus isn't prominently mentioned in historical documents from the 1st century. Some scholars believe he may have been a minor Roman administrator, perhaps a prefect or a proconsul stationed in Judea under Emperor Tiberius. Others argue he may never have existed at all, calling him a literary creation, a name attached to a story centuries later to give it credibility. But here's where it gets interesting. Linguistic analysis of the letter shows that its Latin phrasing matches early imperial bureaucratic style. The formal tone, the address to the Roman Senate, the references to local unrest, these all feel consistent with Roman administrative correspondence of the period. Could it be a remarkably clever forgery? Possibly, but even then, the level of detail is eerily accurate for someone supposedly writing centuries later. More importantly, the content doesn't read like myth or fable. It doesn't have the poetic, theological stylings we often find in Christian apocrypha. Instead, it reads like a report, dry, observational, and dare we say sincere. There's no preaching, no miracles. Just a man describing another man who, in his words, was unlike anyone he had ever seen. If Lentulus existed, and that's a big if, he would have lived in one of the most volatile times in Judea's history. A time of political uprisings, messianic movements, and increasing tensions between Rome and the local Jewish population. Think of him as a government official stationed in a modern-day conflict zone, reporting to his superiors about a charismatic local figure, drawing massive crowds, causing unease among local authorities, and possibly threatening the region's fragile stability. In that context, writing a report about Jesus makes perfect sense. And think about this. If you were a Roman official in the first century and saw a Jewish teacher whose following was growing, whose words sparked unrest, and whose presence was impossible to ignore, you'd report it, especially if that teacher's influence extended beyond religion and into politics. That's the heart of what makes this letter so powerful. It doesn't treat Jesus as just a religious figure. It sees him as a potential political force. Let's pause here and imagine a modern comparison. In 1960s America, Martin Luther King Jr. was seen by his followers as a moral prophet. But to the FBI, he was a political threat. He was watched, surveilled, documented, not because of his sermons, but because of the movement he was building. Could Jesus, in Lentulus' eyes, have been the same? This kind of framing changes everything. It pushes us to ask, was Jesus just a teacher of love and forgiveness? Or was he also a disruptor, a man whose radical message about justice, dignity, and God's kingdom struck fear in the hearts of empire builders? The Lentulus letter doesn't give us sermons. It doesn't recount parables. It doesn't even seem concerned with religious doctrine. It simply presents a man whose presence couldn't be ignored, someone whose eyes unsettled Roman guards, someone whose bearing demanded respect, even from those tasked with crushing insurrection. If this was Lentulus's genuine reaction, or even the reaction of someone close to him, it speaks volumes. Now, for skeptics, the question remains, why isn't Lentulus mentioned in other Roman texts? Shouldn't someone this important have shown up elsewhere? Not necessarily. The Roman Empire was vast, and countless minor officials left no record. Many letters were never preserved. Countless documents were lost, burned, or hidden, especially ones that might have been seen as politically dangerous or theologically disruptive. History isn't always about what survives. It's often about what doesn't. We've seen it with the Dead Sea Scrolls. We've seen it with the Gospel of Judas. Texts once dismissed as legend later proved to have historical weight when rediscovered. So even if Publius Lentulus remains a shadowy figure, the style, tone, and context of the letter are enough to demand serious consideration. At the very least, this isn't your typical forgery, and at most it could be a glimpse into how Jesus appeared through Roman eyes. Eyes trained to spot rebellion and power, not just holiness and humility. And that leads us to the next question. What exactly did Lentulus see? In the next section, we'll explore the letter's vivid physical description of Jesus, one that contradicts everything you've ever seen in Sunday school or stained glass. What does Jesus look like in your mind? For most people, the image is clear. Shoulder-length brown hair, olive skin, soft features, and kind eyes. That serene face appears everywhere, from paintings in cathedrals to the covers of children's Bibles to Hollywood's many portrayals. But where did that image actually come from? Certainly not the Bible. The Gospels say almost nothing about Jesus' physical appearance. For 2,000 years, Christian imagination filled in the blanks, and the result is a Jesus shaped more by art, politics, and Western ideals than the historical reality. That's what makes the Lentulus letter so jarring. It provides a rare and radically different description of Jesus, one that could flip centuries of sacred iconography on its head. According to Lentulus, Jesus wasn't the soft, gentle figure we've come to expect. He was strikingly tall, taller than most men of his time, with a strong, athletic build. This wasn't a fragile mystic who wandered through hills preaching peace. This was a man who looked like he could lead, fight, and stand his ground. The letter describes his hair as light-colored, wavy, not long and dark as Renaissance painters imagined, but more like a soldier's cut than a prophet's. His beard, too, was short and fair, not the dramatic flowing beard we often see in Orthodox icons. But it's the eyes that stop readers in their tracks. Lentulus describes them as piercing, light-colored, possibly blue, and intensely expressive. A gaze so powerful that it could shake people to their core. Not just warm and understanding, but authoritative. A look that saw through you. Let's think about that for a second. Eyes are more than just a physical trait. They're a window into someone's presence. Lentulus doesn't just describe what Jesus looked like. He describes how it felt to be near him. It wasn't comfort, it was awe. Imagine standing in front of someone whose presence made you forget what you were about to say. Someone whose very being felt too large for the space they stood in. That's the Jesus Lentulus paints. A man whose inner strength was so visible, it manifested in his physical body. And yet, this completely overturns the modern image of Jesus as the ultimate pacifist. For centuries, Christianity has emphasized meekness, humility, and self-sacrifice. That's the image that works well in Sunday sermons, in devotional art, and in institutions that value obedience over confrontation. But what if the original Jesus was confrontational? Not violent, not hostile, but deeply unafraid. A man who could walk into a temple, overturn tables, and make crowds follow him, not just because of what he said, but because of who he was. A man who wasn't only teaching love, but also defying oppression. We've seen how visual representation shapes belief. When artists began portraying Jesus as white and European, it subtly changed how he was understood, especially in the West. It made him familiar, unthreatening, domesticated, a savior who fits neatly into the systems of power he might once have challenged. But the Lentulus letter throws that all into question. It invites us to consider a Jesus who was culturally and physically different. Someone who stood out, possibly even intimidated people. Someone who didn't just blend into a crowd but electrified it. To some, that image is inspiring. It feels more human, more powerful, more like someone who could spark a movement that would endure centuries. To others, it's uncomfortable. If Jesus was muscular, intense, and fiercely charismatic, does that mean we've missed something fundamental about him? Have we focused too much on his death and too little on the strength he showed in life? Here's a modern-day parallel. Think of public figures like Nelson Mandela or Malala Yousafzai. They carry a calmness that comes not from weakness, but from conviction. Their words matter because their presence commands attention. That's the kind of strength Lentulus saw in Jesus. It also raises new theological questions. If this Jesus was so striking in appearance, if his presence alone demanded respect, was that part of his divine identity? Was he sent not only to speak truth, but to embody it with every gesture, every glance? Or more provocatively, have we, over centuries, softened his image to make it easier to follow him without being too challenged by him? That's not just speculation. Historical precedent shows that religions adapt images of their founders over time to suit the needs of their communities. Saints become symbols, prophets become legends, and human complexity gets smoothed over for the sake of clarity. But clarity is not always truth. That's what makes the Lentulus letter so powerful. Whether it's authentic or not, it forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the historical Jesus was far more commanding, more physically and emotionally intense than the gentle teacher we've been shown. And it begs a deeper question. If Jesus looked and moved like a revolutionary, could it be that he actually was one? In the next section, we'll explore how Lentulus described not just Jesus' appearance, but his character, his strength, compassion, intellect, and the tension between love and power that defined his leadership. Lentulus didn't just describe what Jesus looked like. He captured something deeper, who Jesus was. In the letter, Jesus is portrayed as a man of deep thought, stern presence, and striking compassion. Lentulus doesn't paint him as a passive spiritualist, but as someone who wielded both intellect and emotional strength with precision. He writes of a man whose wisdom was beyond words and whose clarity unsettled people in power. This is a significant departure from the often one-dimensional portrayals we see. Lentulus saw a man who could command respect without violence. His authority didn't come from titles or wealth, but from the force of conviction in his voice and the compassion in his gaze. Today, we might compare that kind of leadership to figures like Abraham Lincoln or Václav Havel, men who led not by domination, but by moral gravity. People followed because they believed in the integrity behind the message. Lentulus also describes Jesus as someone who deeply cared for the poor and marginalized, traits that echo gospel narratives. But here they coexist with a more serious, even commanding tone. He wasn't just tender, he held people accountable. That duality is powerful. Could this be the Jesus Rome feared? A charismatic man who moved hearts and minds, but also threatened systems of control? Lentulus's choice to write to the Roman Senate hints at this. His tone is cautious but respectful. He's not warning of a lunatic. He's reporting on someone who might disrupt the order of things. That dual image, a healer and a disruptor, forces us to reevaluate Jesus' mission. Was he teaching people how to get to heaven, or showing them how to resist injustice right here on earth? The historical record supports the tension. Jesus challenged both Roman and Jewish authorities. He broke norms. He overturned tables. He forgave sinners, healed outsiders, and dared to redefine power. Lentulus's letter reinforces this, not with theology, but with first-hand awe. In today's terms, Jesus would be the kind of figure who moves across ideological lines, a radical voice of conscience that unsettles the powerful while comforting the forgotten. Someone who can't be neatly categorized. That's why this letter matters. It invites us to see Jesus not only as divine, but fully human, complex, intense, and dangerously inspiring. Next, we'll examine how the world has responded to the letter, academics, theologians, and everyday believers, and how this resurfaced document is sparking debates that may reshape Christianity itself. When the Lentulus letter resurfaced, the ripple effects were immediate, and they haven't stopped. Historians called it one of the most provocative finds in recent memory. Religious institutions braced for questions, and ordinary believers were left grappling with a version of Jesus they had never imagined. Carbon dating from the University of Oxford had confirmed the parchment's material belonged to the 1st century. That alone was enough to jolt the academic world. For decades, this document had been labeled a medieval fabrication, a legend, a curiosity. Now scholars were forced to take a second look. Some biblical scholars saw potential gold, a Roman official, possibly writing within Jesus' lifetime, describing him in vivid human terms, not a theology lesson, not a miracle story, but a historical footprint. Others weren't convinced. They raised valid concerns. The letter could be a later creation mimicking ancient style. Its Latin, while consistent with Roman bureaucratic writing, still shows oddities. Could it be from a later sect trying to reframe Jesus as a more regal or militant figure? Skepticism is healthy. Historical scholarship thrives on it. But even if the letter isn't authentic in the strictest sense, it still holds value. Why? Because it reveals something powerful. How people, even centuries ago, were already trying to make sense of Jesus in ways that differed from the official story. And when that alternative story contradicts centuries of religious tradition, the impact is seismic. Among Christian institutions, the reactions were mixed. The Catholic Church moved quickly to assert that the letter wasn't part of the canonical Gospels. Bishops and theologians warned the faithful not to let the letter distort Jesus' true message of peace and salvation. A Jesus who seemed militaristic or overly forceful, they argued, could mislead believers and stir confusion. But other voices, particularly progressive theologians, saw this as an opportunity. What if this isn't a threat, they asked, but a gift? A window into Jesus as he really was, raw, complex, human, divine, all at once. Some even welcomed the tension. Why not let the image of a strong, authoritative Jesus stand alongside the one of a suffering servant? Couldn't both be true? After all, the Jesus who healed the sick also confronted corrupt power. The Jesus who preached forgiveness also endured torture without breaking. Outside of seminaries and church halls, public interest exploded. Headlines read, "Jesus is warrior," or "Ancient letter reveals shocking description of Christ." Documentaries rushed into production. Podcasts dissected every line. YouTube debates raged between theologians, historians, and skeptics. Joe Rogan's comment added fuel to the fire. On his podcast, he mused, "People find it hard to believe Jesus rose from the dead. But this seems more real." His words captured a cultural moment. People are ready to reconsider Jesus, not to dismiss him, but to rediscover him. On social media, reactions varied. Some believers felt betrayed. The Jesus they had loved since childhood, the gentle Savior with soft eyes and a peaceful heart, was being challenged by an unfamiliar image. Others felt intrigued, even empowered. A Jesus who looked like a leader, who wasn't afraid to stand tall and speak truth. That felt real. One woman on Twitter wrote, "I've been a Christian my whole life. I cried when I read the Lentulus letter. Not because it shattered my faith, but because it gave it new depth. I never imagined Jesus looking like that. But maybe I needed to." In churches, Bible study groups began asking new questions. Is it possible we've emphasized only half the truth about Jesus? What does strength really look like in a man of God? Can someone be both gentle and formidable? And then, broader conversations followed. In countries where Christianity is intertwined with national identity, the image of a strong Jesus was interpreted politically. Some saw it as a justification for social action. Others feared it could be used to legitimize aggression. In places where faith and resistance meet, Latin America, parts of Africa, and even urban centers in the US, this new image resonated. Jesus wasn't just saving souls. He was standing up to empires. He was speaking out for the poor. He was dangerous to the status quo. That's what unsettled people the most. This wasn't just a theological curiosity, it was a cultural bombshell. Because if Jesus was physically powerful, intellectually fierce, and politically threatening, then maybe faith isn't just about heaven. Maybe it's about justice too. In the next and final section, we'll explore the real impact this letter could have on Christianity's future, and what it means for how we understand not just Jesus, but ourselves. So now we ask the question that's been quietly echoing in the background. What if this changes everything? What if the Lentulus letter, whether authentic or not, forces us to look at Jesus with new eyes, sharper, more open, more historically grounded? What if it invites us to revisit not just what we believed, but why we've believed it? For centuries, the gentle, meek Jesus has offered comfort. He's been the image of mercy, the Prince of Peace, the embodiment of love and sacrifice. That Jesus has touched hearts, changed lives, and carried countless people through pain, war, oppression, and despair. That image is not wrong, but it may not be complete. The Jesus Lentulus describes isn't opposed to the Jesus of the Gospels. He's the other side of the same coin, still compassionate, still deeply loving, but also bold. He walks into the temple and flips tables. He stares down Pharisees. He rebukes leaders. He walks into danger, not as a lamb led to slaughter, but as a man on a mission. And that brings us to the real tension. The Lentulus Jesus doesn't contradict the gospel Jesus. He complicates him. That complexity is hard to hold. We live in a culture that craves simplicity. We want clear categories: strong or gentle, judge or savior, warrior or healer. But real people aren't like that, and maybe the Son of God wasn't either. Look at the world today. We're surrounded by injustice, greed, fear, and division. Is the image of a meek Jesus enough to confront those forces? Or do we also need to recover the Jesus who stood up to empire? The Jesus whose very presence challenged the powerful and uplifted the broken? In that light, the Lentulus letter doesn't weaken faith, it sharpens it. It pushes us to stop asking, "Is this how I want Jesus to look?" and start asking, what kind of Jesus do we actually need right now? For the church, this discovery or rediscovery poses a serious challenge. If institutions have softened Jesus' image to make the faith more palatable, more marketable, more comfortable, then this letter is a call to repentance, not doctrinally, but imaginatively. Have we turned Jesus into a symbol that serves power rather than a person who disrupted it? And for everyday believers, this is more personal. The image we hold in our hearts shapes how we live. If we only see Jesus as gentle, we may avoid confrontation. If we only see him as powerful, we may forget mercy. But if we can hold both, strength and gentleness, judgment and grace, boldness and compassion, then we don't just see Jesus more clearly. We start to reflect him more honestly. That's the deeper message of the Lentulus letter. It may not change doctrine overnight. It may never be universally accepted, but it shakes the foundation just enough to ask, are we following a Jesus created by tradition or one who defied it? The answer ultimately is up to us. In history, a single text can spark a reformation. A single image can reframe centuries, and a single question can lead to transformation. So here's the question. If Jesus truly looked like this, stood like this, spoke like this, challenged like this, how would that change the way we follow him? Would we still see him only in cathedrals and creeds? Or would we start seeing him in the fight for justice, in the courage to speak truth, in the refusal to bow to fear? Because if the Lentulus letter shows us anything, it's that Jesus was never small. He was a storm in sandals, a thunderclap in the human form. A leader so compelling, even a Roman official had to write home about him. Maybe that's the Jesus we've been waiting to rediscover, not to replace the one we know, but to complete him. And maybe, just maybe, we were never meant to settle for less. The Letter of Lentulus is not just an ancient artifact. It's a mirror, a challenge to our assumptions, a call to wrestle with Jesus not as a myth, but as a man whose very presence could shake empires. Whether fact or forgery, this letter confronts us with the uncomfortable truth that we might have accepted a partial Jesus, when the full Jesus, bold, brilliant, complex, is far more demanding and far more powerful.